What are the consequences of cutting deals with Libya's competing factions? This week saw the forced evacuation of a migrant ship in the port of Misrata. The 79 aboard had been directed back to Libyan shores on instructions, say human rights groups, from the Italian Maritime Rescue Coordination Center. This after a vessel came and saved them from a rubber dinghy in the Mediterranean. The closing of Europe's borders to the Libyan route has drastically reduced the numbers of those trying to cross the Mediterranean this year, but it's also included what aid agencies call Faustian pacts with local authorities whose legitimacy is up for discussion. Yes, 7 years after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya is still a failed state with competing factions, with sometimes, by the way, competing Western backers. There is hope after the heads of rival governments in the east and Tripoli met last month at a conference in Palermo that perhaps there can be some sort of a compromise. You'll be hearing, by the way, the UN Special Envoy. He's told France 24 that both Fayez Sarraj in Tripoli and Khalifa Haftar in the east want to be part of the political process. How do you put Libya back together again? One of the questions we're asking today in the France 24 debate. And with us, former UN General Dominique Trinquant. Welcome back to the show.
Good evening.
I want to welcome as well from Trieste, journalist and commentator Marco Gambacci, editor of the European Post. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you again.
From Rome, Libya analyst and commentator Emad Abadi. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And from Florence, Virginie Colombier teaches at the European University Institute. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. By the way, the migrants and refugees evacuated from that ship, neither under the jurisdiction of either of the two leaders that we just mentioned. They're in Misrata, and Misrata's got its own faction in control there. France 24's James Andre was there earlier in the week and in contact with those migrants before they were evacuated. He joins us now from the capital, Tripoli. James, what's the latest? All right, we seem to have lost the connection there with James Andre. We'll try to connect with him and get the latest on that vessel, which was forced back, a story that we've been watching. A couple of points. First of all, on the closing of the Libyan route. I'll begin with you, Marco Gambacci. Libyan territorial waters under a deal struck with the European Union extended. Hence that ship returning to Libyan shores. What's been the reaction to this story where you are?
Actually, it looks like a joke, a very sad joke, because since Italian closed the ports in Sicily, in Naples, in Calabria, in Puglia, many of the European leaders accused the Italian government not to respect the human rights. But after we have seen that also France closed the airports, and as well, a part of one case, the Aquarius case, also Spain closed the border. So I don't see that there is a lot of solidarity when we come to speak about migrants. And the solution cannot be to welcome all the migrants in Europe, but is to find a solution in Africa, and not just in Libya, in the North Africa, but especially in the sub-Saharan Africa.
Find a solution in sub-Saharan Africa. We have the connection now with James Andre in Tripoli. James, you were in contact with those aboard that ship before it was forcibly evacuated earlier this week. You're now back in Tripoli, and we just heard from Marco Gambacci saying that this one case, don't put the blame on Italy. It's all of the European Union that is in step when it comes to closing that Libyan route. First of all, tell us what's the latest when it comes to those who were aboard that ship.
Well, look, the latest is that indeed the ship was evacuated. As you said, that was a couple of days ago. On that day, we actually had a message from the migrants on board we'd been in contact with for a few days already. We tried ourselves to get to the ship. The migrants had said that if the France 24 team, which is in Libya right now and that I'm part of, managed to get to the ship, well, they would let us come up on board and interview them, talk to them and see their life conditions. Well, we were prevented from doing that. Port authorities in Misrata never gave us the green light to approach the boat. We tried for 2 days but did not succeed. Now, what did happen on the day the evacuation took place? Well, we got a message at 11:12 local time here in Tripoli, and that message simply said, the Coast Guard are coming, they have guns. Now, what we do know is that just before the boat was stormed, there was a first potential attempt. That was maybe 5 days earlier when indeed police in the port decided to try and enter the boat. Well, that did not work out, and they decided to back off from that stage onwards. Well, the migrants had completely sealed themselves off inside the boat. They were armed with iron bars with fire extinguishers. On the other hand, the port security, riot police and Coast Guard had created a wall around the ship itself in the port. That's something a lot of witnesses actually told us. And, well, indeed, 2 days ago they gave the assault. Witnesses on the scene say that some people were hurt. They say between 7 and 10 people injured in that assault on the ship, which involved the usage of tear gas and rubber bullets. The 7 to 10 people were evacuated to a hospital in Misrata. The others, so the total was 79, so minus 7 or 10, we don't know exactly. Well, they are now in a detention center, which is in or near Misrata.
Yeah, James, you sat down with the UN envoy. Ghassan Salami said the UN keeping close ties on their fate, but also looking at the problem from the Libyan perspective. He says those that are being held in detention centers, he mentioned the figure of some 3,000, a drop in the bucket compared to all the illegal migrants currently in Libya. Let's take a listen.
Mr. Haftar wants to be part of the political process. He certainly has his conditions. He certainly has his ambitions. But any Libyan has conditions and ambitions. Why not him?
All right, apologies. That was the wrong soundbite of Ghassan Salami. James, what else did the UN Special Envoy tell you when it came to more broadly the issue of all the, what is it, some 740,000 illegal migrants currently in Libya?
That's it. Now, 740,000 legal and illegal migrants, to be completely exact. But the fact of the matter is, Libya is a very old, rich country. It's got a very small population, about 5.5 million people. And indeed, for a very long time now, well, the Libyans have relied on foreigners to work in the country because they needed labor here in Libya. And for a very, very long time, for decades, it has been a land of immigration with job opportunities for people from sub-Saharan Africa. So, indeed, what Ghassan Salami was saying there is that, yes, there are, some of these migrants, and he was saying in that soundbite you're talking about, but he did tell us that there's a difference to make between asylum seekers who have left their countries because they were threatened, either politically, threatened for their life, and migrants, economic migrants, who, he says, are much less determined to take the risk, to run the risk of crossing the Mediterranean on a boat, knowing that they might capsize, that they might be in a very difficult situation. And so, indeed, the Special Representative, Secretary General here, was telling us that indeed it's only about the exact figure we got this morning, because we actually witnessed a repatriation by the UNHCR, the Refugee Council, this morning, a plane taking 135 migrants to Niger, from where they would be relocated in various countries. Well, this morning we were told that the exact figure for the UNHCR, so we're talking about the people who are in detention centers and who have been registered by the UNHCR, that's 3,800 people.
James Andre reporting live from Tripoli. Many thanks for joining us in the France 24 debate. I want to get reaction from Emad Badi. In that interview with Ghassan Salami, the UN Special Representative, Emad said that in the long run, Libya needs rebuilding, and those migrants that are in the country, he feels as though they'll be needed. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely sure. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to participate. Secondly, with regards to your question, I think it's definitely it's certainly unarguable that Libya needs migrants in terms of labor. However, the way this problem has been dealt with by European states and by Libyans in general reflects two problems that I see are these issues are important to debate. First of all, there has always been two tracks that European state usually adopt in terms of Libya. They usually have the diplomatic track, whereby everyone promotes ideal liberal democratic values, and they have a separate track, a more hard security track, whereby this would be implemented through defense, intelligence agencies, and sometimes development programs to be implemented within the context of national interest. That is how the migrants issue has been dealt with in Libya. The strategy currently adopted by the European state is one of total deterrence, of not allowing them to come back. We've seen that exemplified by several showdowns that related to both the Aquarius, the Niveen, and European states both refused to allow them to dock. And in the case of the Aquarius, Italy even unilaterally pulled its registration from being able to operate. So you have this tendency to also criminalize search and rescue missions. Now, this debate needs to be had with regards to how Libya needs to use the migrants, but there's also the other debate which needs to be had, which is how EU states can actually help without with dichotomized approach having destructive effects.
Yeah, that's an important question. Virginie Colombier, let me ask you, how do you help Libya, help the migrants, and not have what politicians on this side of the Mediterranean are saying, this pull factor, which encourages people to make a perilous journey in an unruly fashion when they're not properly processed, and frankly, by public opinion surveys shows they're not wanted.
Well, first of all, I think, as you rightly pointed, there is an important factor to underline, which is the issue of immigration and migrants trying to escape Libya has become a domestic political issue in a number of European countries. First of all, Italy, but also France and, across Europe. And the way this issue has been used and instrumentalized also by political actors in Europe have had an important impact on the way the issue of the file has been dealt with on the ground. Here, I think it's quite obvious over the past months there is an increased tendency to, not over the last month, but the way European parties has been dealing with actors in Libya has, as Imad pointed out, you have the diplomatic discourse, which has been basically to say we support the work of UNSMIL, we support political reconciliation, we want to reach a political settlement of the crisis in Libya, while at the same time, because of domestic political interest, actions on the ground have sometimes tended to go against this diplomatic discourse and position. And the fact, for instance, that you've had unilateral action by some governments, especially the Italian, but also the French, supporting some specific armed factions on the ground because they were perceived as maybe capable or more efficient at tackling the problem of migration, has had a very negative impact also on the legitimacy and capacity of the government in Tripoli. So I think this the way the issue is dealt with politically in Europe also affects very directly the political situation in Libya, and not in a way that makes it easier for the authorities, central authorities, to the extent that they're capable of doing this, to deal with the situation. So it makes the problem even more difficult to deal with.
General Trinquant, do you agree with that?
Yes, of course. The problem is worse because you've got the two parties which are supported by different countries, not only France and Italy, but Egypt also, Qatar, which is supporting General Haftar. So it's put that all very difficult. But we're talking about two different things: the problem of refugees and migrants, and the problem of the internal crisis in Libya. Because, as we said, Libya needs migrants.
But you heard Virginie Colombier saying that basically the Western powers or European powers banking on whichever faction they think will be best able to keep those migrants from crossing over.
No, I think really we must be careful. The problem of migrants in Europe, they've got three routes to go into Europe: east, center, and west. Center, of course, is Libya. There was a large flow of people coming from Libya. It's no longer the case. Now the people are coming from Spain. So we are focusing on the problem of a boat with dozens of people. 79 people. When we're talking about 100, and we're talking about 100,000 or million people. So we are focusing on that problem of migrant, which is not really a big problem currently in Libya. But the problem is what, as Jeremy said, is the problem of stabilization the region, which is not the case because you've got external power who influence the situation inside Libya.
External powers, each with their favorites. We're going to pick up on that point with the panel. When we come back, you're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're looking at the Libya crisis with former UN General Dominique Trinquant. Marco Combacci, editor of the European Post, is with us from Trieste in Italy. Also joining us from Italy, Libyan commentator Emad Badi. He's in the capital, Rome. And Virginie Colombier joining us from Florence. Emad Badi, who mentioned the two ships that have been in the news on this side of the Mediterranean over the past months. One is that one that we saw, the Nevin there, which rescued those migrants and brought them back to Misrata. The other is the Aquarius. Now, after having its registration withdrawn under EU pressure, that rescue vessel is now confined to the port of Marseille, and now Italian magistrates have called for its impoundment. This over the alleged illegal dumping of medical and other toxic waste. MSF, which runs the Aquarius, calls this a demonization.
Let me tell you that it is very difficult not to see a common thread between all these events. We can call all this a criminalization of solidarity, a criminalization of humanitarian medical activity, and in particular of activity at sea.
A very different reaction from Italy's interior minister / deputy prime minister / head of the far-right League party, Matteo Salvini, tweeting on the day, "The party is over." Earlier, he'd sent a previous post over Twitter saying, quote, "It seems I did well to close the Italian ports to the NGOs." Your thoughts on all this? Marco Combacci, when you see the end of these rescue vessels in the Mediterranean, what's been the reaction in Italy to all of this week?
Lega Nord continue to get the support of the Italian people. If you see any polls, any political polls, you can see that Lega Nord is rising in the polls. Right now, it's more than 30%. So it means that stopping those NGOs arriving in the Italian harbor was very popular among the Italian population. But I would like to differentiate two things. One thing is the NGO who were going to rescue the migrants almost off to the Libyan coast, creating almost a situation of human trafficking, because there were the recording of the calls between the Libyan people who were deciding where to drop the migrants, so the NGO were coming to rescue them. Another thing are the other NGOs who were acting in good faith to rescue the migrants who were in a real danger of life. So there is two different issues here. And the work that some NGOs have done to save a lot of life makes me very proud to be Italian, makes me proud to be European. But the work that other NGOs were doing, and they were going a bit too far, their duty, let me think really a lot, and let me think about why we have such populism in Europe.
And do you agree with Virginie Colombier when she talks about how you have different European governments supporting different factions in Libya in the hopes that betting on which one will be better at keeping the migrants from crossing over? Marco Gambacci?
It was my question.
Yes.
Do I have to answer?
Yes, please.
Sorry, I thought it was for Virginie. It was for Virginie. No, there is no European Union in this. The President of the European Parliament, more than one time decided that we have to reform Dublin. And there is not anymore the question that the country where the migrants are arriving should be the first to welcome them. There should be a repatriation. But if the other countries, such as Austria, Hungary, the Visegrad countries, but as well France and many others, are not willing to welcome the migrants, we have seen that for one Basel, Albania offered itself to welcome the migrants. So there is a shortcut, there is a circuit that doesn't work. There is a situation where no one wants to welcome them, but wants the other to welcome these migrants.
But what about Marco? What I'm asking about is on the other end. Are Europeans making the problems worse by supporting competing Libyan factions?
Yes, but indeed. If you think that on one side, supporting the Tripoli government led by Sarraj, there is Italy, UN, Turkey, and Qatar. But on the other side, supporting Haftar government in Cyrenaica, there is France. So we are seeing two of the main important, the most important European countries going one against each other. And if you check also during the Palermo conference, that was not a success because there were no politicians, there were no EU leaders, there were no US representatives. It's because if France and Italy, they don't agree on how to resolve the situation, or how to reconcile the two different factions, Sarraj and Haftar, there will be no political solution in Libya, and we will still continue to see this crisis. Because we have to also know history. Libya is a fictional state. It was created by the Kingdom of Italy in 1911 when they unified Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. And after the Second World War, for example, I'm giving just this example, after the Second World War, Libya became British. And the British government found the king, Idris, who was part of the Cyrenaica. And they say, no, you will be the king of Libya. King said, no, I want to be the king of Cyrenaica because I don't know anyone in Tripolitania. Just to see that Libya is a very separated country. And it's not just Sarraj and Haftar, but there are a galaxy of other thousands of different militias, factions, groups, including jihadists in Sirte, for example.
Yeah, we're going to bring up the map now. When the leaders of competing Libyan factions sat down, as Marco was mentioning, in Palermo last week, the map of Libya, well, it roughly resembled what it was back in September with General Haftar's forces in the east, the UN-backed government of Sarraj in the more towards the west, but then a myriad of others down south. There are Tuareg and Tubus. There are jihadists of various ilks as well, especially in the south. it's difficult to make sense of that map, isn't it, General Tangon?
Yes, it is difficult. And as Michael said, that there were a European problem on migrants, there is also a European problem in Libya. Why Italy and France should be alone to have their own view on
Why is it?
Why? Because we should have a European position on that.
Why aren't they backing the same horse?
In fact, the problem is that from the start, because of the war 7 years ago, France wanted to do something in Libya. But Italy, in historical terms, of course, want to be part, and it's very close also from Italy. And also you've got the oil problem between Total and Eni. So they want to get in. But in fact, I mean, really the problem is that two European countries can have a different position on something which is of interest for Europe. It's of interest for Europe, let me tell you, not really on migrants today, but on the problem of security in the area. Fights are going on in Chad, in south of Libya currently. And you've got problem everywhere, and this is a problem for Europe. So that's why I can't understand why there is not an agreement prior to go to a meeting like that and to have a meeting in Paris, then a meeting in Palermo, and with Marshal Haftar on one side, the other one, the representative supported by UN and supported also by France.
Why have the French been drawn towards General Haftar and not towards the UN?
I think they are trying to balance the problem. The problem is that Marshal Haftar is leading the army. You've got the weapons, and that's very important in Libya. Not only in the east, but in the west, the government have nothing, not even a parliament. So there is a discussion, and Marshal Haftar, when he was in a meeting in Paris, recognized that the political leader, he didn't want to be a political leader. He wants to lead the army, and the political leader needs to be Mr. Sarraj. And so, really, the two countries, Italy and France, must get together.
If it was that simple, he would have taken part in the plenary proper, right, in Palermo. He wouldn't have stayed off to the side and said, I don't want to join in with the others.
Because Palermo was just put on the table like that. I mean, it was not really prepared, like a UN negotiation.
All right. Even though General Haftar did not attend the conference per se, he did meet with Sarraj on the sidelines. And the UN envoy, Ghassan Salame, in that interview with France 24, insists that Haftar now wants end to political discussions.
Mr. Haftar wants to be part of the political process. He certainly has his conditions. He certainly has his ambitions. But any Libyan has conditions and ambitions. Why not him? But to the basic question, is Mr. Haftar interested by the political process? My answer is yes. And I know that he supports the convening of the national conference in the beginning of next year.
Mr. Badi, are you convinced by what you just heard?
Well, I mean, it's difficult. It will be particularly difficult to speculate on Libyan development. However, the hard reality, I would say that the reaction is almost always to compartmentalize Libya in really nice tracks. So you have the political track, you have the economic track, you have the security track, and you have the political process. And you also have the migration problem. And most people think that these are not interlinked. However, the policies that have been adopted have, as Virginie demonstrated, influenced legitimacy. Right now, what we have in Libya and in Tripoli, for instance, is that some armed groups have been able to manufacture their own legitimacy. Before, that wasn't the case. Before, they used to try and actually seek governmental legitimacy. Now they control banks. They have to disperse cash. They can provide hospitals with equipment. A lot of that has been through their ability to establish being the only reality on the ground and having the weapons they have been able to establish links with internationals unilaterally, international states. Now, where Haftar steps in is that he's the only constant in a constantly fractionalizing environment. He is the only one force, which he calls the Libyan National Army, as a what Palermo is he only attended the security-related meeting, and that goes back to what I said earlier. Haftar, through political advice, through Russia's influence, through maybe his own understanding of the Libyan situation, realizes that the security track or an ability to have a certain control over the territory does over the government of national accord, gives him automatically, first of all, credibility. Second of all, it gives him monopoly over force, and that automatically means that he gains in, which is what Macron gave him, and which is also what the Italians gave him. So, in a way, he recognizes that the security track often supersedes the political process.
All right,
that's the situation that we're in here. We're here at now, and I think that in both. Yeah.
Let me bring in Virginie Colombier on this. Virginie,
yes.
Marshal Haftar, he does have weapons. He does have militias. He's not the only one. At this particular point in time, if you were sitting down with the French president talking about Libya, what would you advise him?
Well, I think the best advice to be given is also maybe to think a bit more broadly about what strategy for Libya. I think the main focus has been, for obvious reasons of necessity to fix the situation as soon as possible, to try and cut deals. The problem is that it's not very clear anymore what the strategy is for Libya beyond a very short-term political agreement. And I agree with Imad also on the fact that the search for legitimacy of the main actors, and first among which Haftar, has been going through especially control of the security sphere. And in that sense, Haftar has been very good at bringing himself back to the scene, because if you remember 1 year and a half ago, he was quite marginalized. Now he's at the core of the situation. I think everybody agrees that there is no solution to the Libyan conflict without the participation of all the main players, including Haftar. But I think the focus on very short-term elections as the only way out of the crisis cannot be successful. The conditions, not only security, but also political, legal, are not met. But I think fundamentally there is no basic agreement on rules of the game, even for after elections. So elections cannot solve the problem and sharing power within the main parties if immediately after, like already happened many times in the past few years, you have further fragmentations and further division.
And
I think there are a number of key issues that have been deeply,
No, I was going to ask you, how do you get the Europeans to sing from the same hymn sheet, to all be backing the same process and the same leader?
I think basically there are a number of key issues, as I was saying, key issues that are politically contentious and that have to be dealt with. And I think as long as there is no serious discussion and dialogue around these issues, and I think this is the interest of all the main European parties and countries. There are issues pertaining to the security, issues pertaining to the economy. There are basically agreement on some basic rules of the game for the later stage, political life. Nobody's mentioned the form of the political life. Everybody talks about sharing power and organizing elections. Libyans do not agree on what political life can and should be. And I think this might be something very important to focus on, because otherwise you have the risk of, yes, you can organize elections after 6, 9, 10 months, who knows. But then you will have again and again the same problem. Some issues are deeply contentious. They are also deeply political. And I think they have to be discussed, probably in another format than what has been done so far. And probably, like Ghassan Salameh already started to point out, maybe forgetting a bit about these institutions that have been fighting for the past 3 years and organize a different form of dialogue. I mean, the two parliaments, competing parliaments, the strategy that have been implemented over the past 2 years now have failed. I think it hasn't bring about any result. So it's probably time to think about a new strategy. And I see that in this precise moment, we'll see what happens with the national conference. But there is a gap in thinking what can be done except from elections, which I personally think, and I would advise President Macron not to push more towards elections because they will not bring any positive outcome in the short term.
General Trinquant, it's been a quarter century since Somalia's strongman was ousted and it just became a failed state. Could the same thing happen to Libya? It's been 7 years since Gaddafi left. Can you put a functioning state back together again?
For two reasons. I completely agree. We must learn from failure. After the war 7 years ago, we immediately wanted to have election. There were elections, and everything failed. Why? Because the security problem was not solved. And for 7 years now we have a failed state because you got people with weapons who have organized a war state. I mean, with weapons, you can have the oil, you can do whatever you want, or migrants or something like that.
So can you put it all back together again? Can you put Libya back together again?
You need to organize the security problem first, and then have this sort of discussion, which lead to election. But don't want to have the election too quick, because that will solve nothing.
All right, General Dominique Trinquant, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Marco Gambacci for being with us from Trieste, Emad Badi in Rome, Virginie Colombier in Florence, Italy. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Nadia Massi. Good evening. Nadia, a lot of the focus in the media's attention, of course, has been on the migrant issue.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And while I know you have been focusing today on those 70-odd people that were brought from that cargo ship back to a detention centre in Libya, we know really that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to people who are suffering and who are trapped in those detention centres in Libya. And I wanted to draw your attention to this article that came out a little earlier on this week that shows us that for the first time we know that 26 of those detention centres are funded, at least in part, by the UK government and house over 1,000 children. Now, why is it that the UK government is involved with funding these camps, which we know house people in pretty horrendous conditions? Well, as you and your panel have been discussing, Francois, the UK government, like the rest of Europe, says these camps are necessary to dissuade people from making that journey across the Mediterranean into Europe. Critics, though, of course, saying all Europe's doing here, including the United Kingdom in this case, is simply outsourcing their migration problem to North Africa, which is clearly struggling to cope. Plenty of reaction online. I want to show you one of those critics. She says here, tens of millions spent by our government, that's the British government, our taxpayer money, to lock up children in detention camps in Libya where they're starved, beaten and abused. This is the EU's, quote, sustainable, humane solution to stopping migrants from crossing the Mediterranean. And we know, of course, this is in no way a new problem. You may remember it was almost a year ago this month that CNN broke this story saying that people were being sold as slaves for as little as $400.
Well, they had the video footage even to prove it.
Absolutely. It certainly sent waves at the time. But we know today, a new report from Amnesty International coming out saying that actually the situation a year after that shocking footage was released, the situation, Amnesty says, remains bleak and in some cases is worse than when that video initially came out. But what's been really interesting, though, is to look at what the response to all of that criticism is like among politicians here in Europe. There's not been much contrition. There's not been much embarrassment about the role of Europe has in these camps. And by and large, they're sticking to their policy. We know people on the right, of course, think that this has gone, that we need to curb closed borders altogether.
Because I was going to say, these politicians feel as though they have a silent majority backing them.
Indeed. And one politician You may not have expected to weigh in on this debate, but who's a bigger figure really to do so than Hillary Clinton? Here she is today in an interview. The top line there: Europe must curb immigration to stop right-wing populists. Now, she says migration in this article was the big issue that fueled the rise of Donald Trump in the United States and Brexit in the UK. And then she goes on to argue that in order to appease the concerns of voters, Europe must make it even harder for migrants to get on the continent. She specifically calls out Germany here. She says, while I admire the very generous and compassionate approaches that were taken by leaders like Angela Merkel of Germany, as she says, I think it's fair to say that Europe has done its part. She goes on to say, I think Europe needs to get a handle on migration because that's what lit the flame.
Of course, that was 2015. The numbers being let in by Germany are a trickle of what they were back then.
Indeed, and lots of the criticism online today pointing to that precisely. Here's one from a BuzzFeed correspondent. She says here, this is not only ridiculous because what is fueling migration are those people on the right. Migration is already down. And she's right, there was 1 million people coming in 2015. Now we're looking at closer to 76,000 people. So a huge drop there. And as you can imagine, across the board on Twitter today, there's been plenty of criticism of what Hillary Clinton's had to say. That's one. Let me show you just a few others. Here's Nisreen Malik saying, here's should be an honest headline. We must curb immigration because it harms our political chances against populists, as we were too craven to defend it properly and make the case that it is compassionate and a net good for the economy. And now it's too late. Not sure that would fit exactly in a headline, but I think you get the idea that she's trying to go for.
But it certainly is eloquent.
Indeed. And lots of voices really making very similar arguments. Someone else here saying to recommend, as Hillary Clinton does, that Europe now shift further to the right on this issue is callous anti-humanitarianism. So really pretty strong words for Hillary Clinton, who is weighing in to this very contentious debate on Europe.
All right. Many thanks, Daria Massi. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.